All right, everyone, welcome back to our afternoon session. We have a really interesting continuation this afternoon, and we're going to lead it off with Simon Kenion. Simon has an MA in philosophy from the University of St. Andrews, a very fine Scottish institution, for those of you who may not know, and is an associate, a certified APPA philosophical practitioner. He has worked as a scientific researcher on expeditions to Australia and Antarctica, studying the feeding and migratory behavior of blue and humpback whales. Today, he is a fitness polymath who mentors clients into active lifestyles and a health and fitness columnist for the Mallorca Daily Bulletin. Yes, Mallorca, Spain, where he's residing and broadcasting from today. Simon, I hope one day you'll take up the study of the feeding and migratory behavior of philosophers. That's also, I think, very interesting at times. And as far as fitness goes, your work is probably even more important today than it was prior to the pandemic. I dare say we are leading such disembodied lives, as you well know. Here we are on Zoom, and so many of us are spending so much time online now that it's surely not that good for us health-wise. And as I'm sure you know, life expectancy actually is declining in the USA for the first time in many, many decades, more than a century. And this partly also has to do with culturally induced illnesses, among which are these disembodied existences. So I think your work has always been important, but even more important today. Thank you so much for presenting at our annual meeting this year. And please go ahead. The floor is yours, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. It's funny, I think the last time I was at one of these meetings was 7 years ago when I presented the idea for the book. And at that stage, it was really in its infancy, and it's evolved a lot since that time. And at the time, I was sort of spitting lots of philosophical ideas around fitness and trying to apply them, trying to basically segue my way some way into philosophical counseling. I'd done obviously the certification program with you, but having just an MA, I felt a bit disingenuous in going straight into counseling. And I thought, well, I know a lot about fitness, or at least I thought I did. And I thought that might be an interesting segue. So it was 7 years ago now, I asked the owner of a local gym if I could hold a series of talks at his gym on some of my ideas around how I could get people to exercise more. And I sat down with him at a little cafe in Hamburg in Sternsanze, which is just next to the St. Pauli stadium. If you know anything about European football, they're quite a famous club. And I sat down with him and I said, can I hold these talks? And he said, of course, Simon, it's no problem. And he left. And straight away, I started jotting down a series of, I started jotting down a first lecture talk. And then I started writing down a series of topics that I could write about. And then suddenly I realized that, hey, maybe I can write a book on this subject. And right there and then I started vomiting out as much as I could possibly think of about what makes people exercise. But I knew about probably 2% of what has finally ended up in the book. So it's been 7 years of a lot of reading and research and a lot of thinking from the ground up about behavior. When I work with clients now, mainly I work with clients for exercise, especially my fitness mentoring clients. And it's about reconstructing their community's environment to induce a behavior. In this case, in my case, that behavior is exercise. But I also work with clients and I apply what I've learned writing the book to people who maybe, want to perform other types of activities. Maybe it's studying more. Maybe it's having more discipline in the workplace. So I found it has multiple applications to what I've learned writing the book. So that's a little bit of a background. A bit more of a background is that, as you said, I was studying the migratory behavior of whales in Australia. I was working on a research vessel in Australia with the Centre for Whale Research of Western Australia. And liking exercise, I would go and I would exercise on the foredeck of the ship every day And because it was quite an advanced research vessel, and we were also contracted with the Australian Navy, we had a lot of engineers coming on board, a lot of PhD students coming on board from marine biology, and a lot of very intelligent people coming on board. They come on board and they say to me, Simon, how is it you stay in such good shape? And I say, well, I don't eat crap and I exercise regularly. And the funny thing is, these are smart people, and everyone knows that exercise is good for them. And everyone knows that it takes a bit of exercise and not eating certain things. And yet so few people are doing it. Well, more and more people are doing it, but I find that we're getting there's a bit of a polarization. There are lots of people who are taking up fitness, and we see this in the fitness industry. It's really taking off, and more people are exercising. But at the same time, we still have a health pandemic. We have an obesity pandemic, and there's a lot of people going in the wrong direction. And yet, I'm pretty sure, even you guys here, sitting here now, maybe some of you exercise as much as you think is necessary for your longevity, your health, and maybe some of you don't feel you can keep it up. And why does that happen? And what's going on inside our brains that makes some people want to get up off the sofa when they think about exercising, and some people just can't do it. So that's really what the book is about, me trying to wrap my head around all of the variables that go on inside someone's head. They go from sedentary to active. So let me see if I can, there we go. So first of all, motivation is one of those buzzwords that everyone talks about. What is motivation? Well, I read in a sports psychology book that there's over 600 definitions of motivation in the psychology literature. That kind of leaves you a little bit lost, a little bit of a semantic jungle. And so as I write in the book, the best way that I've found to cut through that semantic jungle is to say that motivation technically is anything that makes us move. We just take its etymology. We say, well, motor means engine, and our motives explain our actions. Okay. So what is it that makes us move? Well, something that ties in a little bit with Kane's question to Jeremy, and he was talking about reason being the slave of the passions, and can reason motivate us? Is that one of the problems is that too many of us think that our ideas in our prefrontal cortex, the things that we rationalize, these abstract ideas, the things that get us to move. And it's really not the case, as Hume understood. It's the passions, it's our emotions, it's what's connected with our limbic system, it's our primitive nervous system that really gets us to start moving. So to expand a little bit about the format of the book, I've written the book. It's 95% a science book, it's a psychology book. But I realized that certain lessons about exercise and the moral obligation towards exercise, which I'm not going to expand on just yet, but I realized that those lessons are best understood allegorically, because you need to connect with somebody's limbic system for people to understand. And so let me move to the next slide, see what I've got. Won't go to there yet. So we need to connect with our limbic system. It's our primitive nervous system that gets us to move. It's not, as I explained in the first chapter of the book, it's not these ideas that we often think are the case. It's not, oh, I'm not going to be able to play with my grandchildren. Despite the fact that we constantly see this in the fitness culture, it's like, think about how you're going to feel in the future. Think about what it's going to be like to not be able to walk up a flight of stairs. If we cannot connect, if our nervous system considers that, but it's never experienced the consequence, the emotional consequence of not being able to climb a flight of stairs, or not being able to play with your grandchildren, or suffering from pain when trying to move and when trying to be mobile, then it's not going to motivate us. We cannot connect with those distance reward or consequences as much as we might know it in our prefrontal cortex, unless our prefrontal cortex can connect with our reward system and our reward circuitry, and that depends on our experience, usually, then it's not going to be able to motivate us. So just expand a little bit on Kane's question, can the prefrontal cortex, can reason motivate us? I think it can, but it's a relationship between how much can our prefrontal cortex and our reasoning connect with our limbic system, right? So if those rewards, Jeremy said that memories are perceptions of sense data. And that's what we're doing when we reflect. We employ our prefrontal cortex to reflect on past experiences, and often those past experiences are connected to an emotion that we felt at the time. Now, sometimes this can draw way back to traumas from our childhood, so it's a powerful emotion, and often it's just to do with the frequency and the recency of the memory of what we can remember. So, for example, and also the what's the word I'm looking for? The vividity of that experience. So, for example, we can tell people that smoking is bad for them, but if we also show them a video of somebody coughing up their lungs, or somebody going around a wheelchair with an oxygen tank in tow, then their limbic system is going to say, hey, they're going to be able to empathize and say, oh, actually, I can connect with that emotion. And then maybe their prefrontal cortex can then connect with some sort of reward circuitry. But the point I'm making now is, it's not about the ideas that exercise is good for my health, these abstract ideas. Exercise is going to make me big and strong in the future. Exercise is going to allow me to play with my grandchildren. That's not what motivates us. Okay. We have a present bias, and motivation is about a distant future, a low resolution seen through binoculars with a dirty lens. So after a lot of time, I realized that I had to restructure the whole format of the book, and I needed to talk about it in terms of energy. Jeremy talked a lot about energy, time, money. Well, if you think time and money, they relate directly towards energy. I think it was Henry David Thoreau said, the price of anything is the amount of life we exchange for it. So I started thinking about exercise in terms of energy. At the end of the day, the great thing that I found about writing my book about exercise is that the difference between exercise and other activities is that we have to expend a lot of energy over a short period of time. So the clarity of these ideas about what motivates us and what's laziness becomes a lot clearer, because it almost magnifies the effect, because it's a lot of energy for a short space of time. So then I started trying to understand and look through everything through the lens of evolutionary psychology. And so what happens when most of us consider exercise? What happens if we consider going out and going for a run? Well, some of us are like, okay, I'll lace up my running shoes and I'll go out, or play tennis as you play, Lou. I'm going to go get my racket. I'm going to call a friend. I'm going to go to the courts. Other people think about it and they're overcome with this emotion of laziness. They think that that's a trait. It's not a trait. Laziness is an emotion. And actually, it's the exact same emotion as fatigue. And I reference a study by Caroline Schluter that shows that actually people with larger amygdalae experience the emotion of laziness more frequently. Now, laziness is also, the amygdala is also the same part of the brain that governs for fear. And if you think fear is an emotion we evolved to protect us from potential threats. So if I see a snake, I experience fear. The snake hasn't done anything yet, sizzling around, it could bite me, but it hasn't done anything yet. But I'm overcome with fear to know if I should flee or fight, or just not do anything and freeze. Okay. But the amygdala is governing my actions in that sense. And it's the same with laziness. The amygdala says, is running around the block going to be a good use of energy? Right? Because obviously you have to think in terms of energy and the fact that it used to be a very precious resource. We had to preserve energy as much as possible for successful evolution and reproduction. And so therefore we've evolved to preserve it at all costs, right? We want to preserve energy. So what happens? We consider running around the block. If we cannot connect running around the block with an underlying biological motive of status, food, sex, or connection, then the most likely scenario is our nervous system is going to protect us with an overwhelming feeling of fatigue, which we call laziness. And what does that do? It encourages us to sit down on the sofa and do something else with our time. So understanding it in this sense, in terms of energy and what the emotion of laziness is, sort of like the first foundation for the schematic that I've built. And you'll see the quote there from Angelo Mosso. He wrote in 1915, fatigue is one of our most marvelous imperfections. And since then, we've come away thinking that it's something that fatigue is something that happens in the body, but it's not. It's something that happens in the brain. And on that point, make a point about effort. So what is effort? Often we think of effort as the mental or physical force we need to achieve something. But actually, effort is always mental. This is something I put in an appendix in my book, but effort is always mental. And what effort is when we're overcome with the emotion of laziness, then we employ our prefrontal cortex. So think of it this way. if I see a saber-toothed tiger, hypothetically, my amygdala will activate and I will run from that threat. My body will say, this is a really good use of energy, and I will start to run. Okay? Expend energy, Simon. My primitive nervous system says, get moving. Okay. What happens if I suddenly tell all of you guys to get up and do 50 squats? Right? Well, there are some social elements going at play around and some oxytocin at work and so on. But most of you are going to go, no, thank you. But then you might think, okay, well, hold on. Is there some consequence of me not doing this? If everyone else gets up, is there some sort of negative reward? And so you'll employ your prefrontal cortex to overcome that laziness. And what we do often is we'll think about exercising, we'll have the emotion of laziness, and then we'll reflect on future benefits. We're going to draw on those memories. We're going to say, oh, well, actually, I felt better last time after I did some exercise. And, oh, well, I'll see Jim or Kate down at the courts. And we reflect on the future, those future benefits. And then sometimes, very rarely, we get up, right? Sometimes. And that's what I call effort. Effort is overcoming the emotion of laziness. It's also using our prefrontal cortex to solve the problems. As I'll talk about in a minute, guidance is really important. Knowing what to do and how to do it is super important. And often we need our prefrontal cortex to solve that problem. So initially, when I wrote up a schematic for behavior, why we do what we do, why we exercise, I was like, okay, well, effort seems to be important. And then there's also stimulating. And it's funny how both Jeremy and Carolina both talked about stimulating their clients, both talked about providing stimulation, some sort of stimulation. And I think that's one of the fundamentals of, well, definitely of my work and my approach is the schematic. We've got to stimulate the nervous system to want to expend energy. And then we have to facilitate it. If you think in Latin or Spanish, fácil, making something easy, just making it, reducing the energetic cost as much as possible. And so if you think of it in that sense, it's, well, what do I do with my clients whenever I want to get them to exercise? I think, right, I'm going to stimulate their primitive nervous system. And there's many ways I do that as much as possible so that they have a willingness, an innate instinctive willingness. They have a nervous system that connects with a more immediate reward or consequence. And I do that by reconstructing their communities and environment. But then I also make sure that it is as well facilitated as possible. It is as convenient as possible. I find an exercise activity that is going to be nearby, fits in with their schedule, make sure that they understand that they need the equipment to be as, easily accessible as possible. But again, it's about energy and mental energy, stimulating the nervous system to want to expend energy, and then making it as simple as possible to achieve that goal. So just expanding a bit more on effort. It's a Taoist proverb that says that which is forced cannot be sustained. And what I think of when I think of that is, I think if we are applying effort to anything regularly, we will probably stop doing it because it's not instinctive. We are not connecting with an immediate reward or consequence. Our nervous system is not thinking, this is a good idea. It's thinking, this is a waste of energy. We are overcome with this feeling of emotional fatigue. And that is normally when we fall off and lose the habit of regular exercise. And obviously this applies to any regular activity, any habit that we might want to take up or might want to keep up with. So if we find ourselves employing our prefrontal cortex too often, we're probably going to fall off the wagon. So yeah, I've got some very simple graphs in my book. I've got the law of instinct, which basically just means, and these are things we know intuitively, as reward increases, and I talk about reward, these are very strict neurochemical rewards. It's serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, anandamide, which I won't go into for the purpose of this because I want to try and stick with the more philosophical framework and the psychological framework as opposed to the details in anthropology and so on. But it's something we instinctively know. Greater reward, the more instinctive it is, the less effort it takes. Just a little point on habit formation as well. The more we automate things, so the more we move things away from our prefrontal cortex, we know from studies with rats in mazes, when the maze is unfamiliar, the rat goes in, the prefrontal cortex is firing constantly. They're trying to solve the problem of how to find the chocolate at the end of the maze. Once that maze becomes familiar, the prefrontal cortex shuts down, and then it only reactivates once they find the chocolate. So what does that mean? It means that when we habitualize things, and I expound on this a lot more detail in the book, just to give you guys a rundown of the book. When we automate behavior after repetition, we hardwire that behavior, effort decreases. Effort decreases because we're using our prefrontal cortex less, right? So there's a final piece of the puzzle missing between stimulating the nervous system and then making it as easy as possible in terms of reducing energy expenditure. And that's guidance. And guidance is seriously overlooked when it comes to creating any sort of behavioral change. Peter Gollwitzer was the first person to say that guidance is more important than motivation. You might have heard of this very famous experiment. Howard Leventhal at Stanford, I think it was at Stanford, did an experiment where he was trying to get students to take tetanus jabs. And so what he did is he gave a bunch of students a pamphlet explaining the detrimental effects of tetanus, how 2 in 10 cases can be fatal, and how it can paralyze you, and all these things that happen with tetanus. And he said that we're giving out free tetanus jabs on campus. With everyone else, he just gave them a map and a timetable of when they could get them. Well, what happened? Significantly more students went just because they had a map. Often we think that we are lazy. We think that we're too tired. We're never too tired. Our nervous system simply thinks that it is not a good expense of energy. And often it's because we don't have a clear path. We don't know how to do it instinctively. So we don't know how to do it, and we don't know exactly what to do. So guidance is something that I work with my clients with a lot. And I think it's something that I think Jeremy pulled as well. He has his pull schedule, basically providing a step-by-step plan from A to B. And I think that's the same thing. I think all these schematics, they overlap considerably. This is just the one that I come up with that works best for me. So yeah, if you think of an arrow is guidance, and in a very simple sense. We see an arrow on a wall. It's a external stimuli. It's giving us external stimuli. It's a visual cue. It's making it easier to go from A to B because it's reducing the energetic cost. And that's where guidance comes in. So a little bit more about the importance of understanding the primitive nervous system. What I do with my clients often is I'll try and get them to frame themselves inside a competence hierarchy. So what I'll do is I'll get them to record, log, and track their own performance markers. And then I'll get them to see if they can track other members of their social group. So list the names so that they're more consciously aware of the other people in their social group for that activity. So for example, I recently been mentoring a student with his exams, and he wasn't engaging enough with the other students. He wasn't feeling like he was part of a competence hierarchy amongst his peers. I said, well, listen, this week, I just want you to list 6 other people in your accounting class. And then the next week, what I want you to do is I want you to tell me the results of each of them from their last exam. And I want you to see where you stack up between them. Now, even though my client knows that their results, the results of his peers, has absolutely no bearing on his life, his primitive nervous system doesn't understand that. What his primitive nervous system thinks is, I have X rank within a competence hierarchy, and I can now see that. During my entire evolutionary history, if I fell down in rank in any competence hierarchy, because normally they weren't abstract, they weren't disconnected, they were present and they were other animals in our immediate vicinity. And if we fell down or perceived ourselves as falling down that competence hierarchy, well, then our nervous system would say, well, we're going to lose out on resources. We're going to lose out on space, partners, food. And suddenly our nervous system would say, you need to get moving. Okay, so it's often a misconception about competition and rank. It's not about being the alpha. We know with chimpanzees and Jane Goodall, it's not about being the alpha. What's important is not falling further down the pecking order. Right? And personally, I'm very much a believer that we are all competitive. And this is just an example of what I do to stimulate my client's nervous system. Is they know it doesn't matter. They know that they're the students, then their results aren't affecting them. But suddenly they have an instinctive drive to want to study, or he had an instinctive drive to want to study more because I'd placed him, or he'd placed himself within a competence hierarchy, and he didn't want to lose out on rank. Obviously, I apply this with exercise as well, but it's about understanding that it is not our prefrontal cortex that is going to guide our actions. It is our nervous system, our primitive nervous system, and how we can stimulate that. So I call this, we talk about the amygdala hijack often in therapy, and we talk about how people are getting stressed because they can't distinguish between getting chased by a saber-toothed tiger and not being able to have their presentation ready for work in the morning. And we get all this stress, and we're trying to help our clients overcome that stress or alleviate that stress. So I think the amygdala hijack is a bad rep. What we also want to do is we want to know, hey, I want to activate my sympathetic nervous system in certain circumstances. I want a little bit of stress. And I think the difference with stress is this: when we know how to perform the task, so when we have that guidance, then that stress isn't so stressful. It becomes beneficial. We expend energy, and we know that we're moving towards the necessary goal. Maybe it's writing the presentation, or maybe it's some exercise. So a little nugget that I came across whilst I was working is sometimes there are these beautiful coincidences. And I was trying to understand the nature of happiness. I was talking about it in terms of moving towards our goals, our fitness goals, and moving away from them, and how it doesn't really matter where we are. So happiness isn't about what we have right now. It's about what we have in relation to a moment ago. So I see this a lot with clients, people who are really overweight, diabetic. They'll train with me and they're quite happy. They suddenly know that they're heading in the right direction for their health. Whereas you check any guy who's a serious athlete, training regularly, he takes 2 days off training, he is miserable. He suddenly knows that he's heading, and especially if he checks his weight or his other performance markers, then suddenly he's like, very, very upset, very moody, very down. And full disclosure, the relationship between serotonin and dopamine is way over my head. But I thought it was very interesting because I was reading Behave from Robert Sapolsky, great book on neuropsychology. And he referenced a study by Wolfram Schultz on rhesus monkeys. And what they found is that if you give them one raisin, they have a little burst of dopamine. If you give them 2 raisins, they suddenly burst more dopamine. If you keep giving them 2 raisins, then that dopamine will stay at a steady level. But suddenly, if you give them 4 raisins, boom, burst of dopamine again. Fantastic. Right? But what happens when you suddenly give them 2 raisins again? Dopamine release completely dwindles. It doesn't go back to what it was at the baseline for 2 raisins. It drops down completely. Right? So what we know is that the dopaminergic system is bidirectional, which for me really ties into knowing that we're moving in the right direction. And, the joys in the journey really ties into Albert Camus' work in The Myth of Sisyphus, however you want to pronounce it. In that, what did he say? He said, the struggle towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One can imagine Sisyphus happy, right? And so it's not about what we have right now. It's about moving towards our goals that creates happiness. And I just thought it was quite serendipitous that when I checked, the discovery of dopamine was in 1957, which coincidentally is the exact same year that Albert Camus won the Nobel Prize for The Myth of Sisyphus, which I thought was a real little serendipitous gem. So, so I have taken quite a scientific, realist, determinist approach to behavior. And that brings up a few useful tools and some philosophical problems. Now, disclaimer, I'm a pragmatist, but we'll put that to one side for now. It's that we want our clients, especially my clients, to start to show different behavior. And we know from all these psychological studies that when we change or manipulate these external variables, then we can create a change of behavior. We know that people are affected by their affiliate communities. We know that we're affected by our surroundings. We know that we're affected by these nudges in our environment. Okay, great. So first of all, I created a very, let me get back to behavioral mechanics. So I call it behavioral mechanics. It's a very simple way that I look at everything. I say, right, so why do we move in terms of energy? Well, when we consider doing anything, what do? Our nervous system considers the expected neurological reward in terms of dopamine and other neurotransmitters, and then it considers the expected energy expenditure. If the expected energy expenditure outweighs that neurological reward, then it's like, laziness, don't do anything. And so my work is always just about saying, okay, they didn't do it. Their expected neurological reward wasn't as high as their expected energy expenditure. How can I try and shift that? Well, I can facilitate it by making it as simple as possible and least energy expenditure as possible in just getting to the gym or starting exercise. So lowering that energetic cost, also in terms of time and money, but they're tied to energy. And then I can also then stimulate the nervous system, making sure that they expect an immediate neurological reward for the activity they're doing. And I think of it as a very simple equation: expected neurological reward, expected energetic cost, and which way the scale is going to tip. So in the book, I reference a little bit of a morbid example for this, but I talk about suicide rates in the UK that plummeted after the switch from natural gas, from town gas to natural gas in the 1970s, I think it was. And so before the switch to natural gas, which isn't as fatal as town gas, across the homes in England, suicide rates were way higher. It's work by Ronald Clark in 1988. He did a report on this. And you think, well, people commit suicide because they're depressed. People commit suicide because they're down, because their intention is to commit suicide. It's like, fine. If that is the only thing that matters and what people think is their interest and their desire and their intention, then why is it that suddenly suicide rates plummet? It's like, no, a change in their environment suddenly meant that when people considered committing suicide before the switch to natural gas with town gas, they thought, okay, all I need to do is I need to stick my head in the oven, and there's going to be no negative neurological concepts of pain, of vertigo, of fear. There might be some fear, but not the same sort of fear as if we were to say, take something like slit our wrists, or vertigo if we jump off a building. So suddenly, because those are obviously other options for people who are depressed, but what town gas did is it facilitated, it basically meant that there was less negative neurological reward. Obviously, neurological reward is net neurological reward. We have to factor in fear, anxiety, serotonin reuptake, as well as dopaminergic release. So expected neurological reward is actually net neurological reward. And when we think about this action quotient is really applicable to so many areas of behavior, because if you think, where do addictions come from? Why are we addicted to TV, pornography, fast food? Well, it's high neurological reward, low energy expenditure. That's why we do these things. Our nervous system's like, sits in front of a TV, it says, fantastic, I've got high neurological reward, very low energy expenditure. I'm going to do that again. So digressing a little bit, going back to talking about how we can explain behavior by manipulating these internal factors. What's the downside of that for our clients? The downside of me talking to my clients and saying, hey, it's not you, don't worry. We're going to change all these things in your environment, and then you're going to change your behavior. Well, suddenly what happens is their locus of control shifts from internal to external. And what happens when our locus of control shifts from internal to external is we have a drop in serotonin. Serotonin is the hormone we need to forgo immediate gratification for future reward. So I call it the willpower paradox. We need to believe that we are in control of our actions. Our clients need to believe that they are in control of their actions. They're in control of their behavior. They're in control of their change. And yet at the same time, understand that these changes in their environment are going to affect their behavior. So again, you can say that willpower exists, willpower doesn't exist. I talk a little bit about the Stanford marshmallow experiment, which seems to be kind of like the cornerstone for the argument that willpower exists. For those of you who don't know, Walter Mischel, about 30 years ago, I think, he put a marshmallow in front of some kids and said, if you abstain from eating the marshmallow right in front of you for 15 minutes, you'll get 2 when we come back. He said, well, some kids have willpower. It's this innate quality. And some kids, well, they don't have it. But that experiment is recently restaged. I can't remember the name of the guys right now who restaged it. But what they found is that these external variables affect children's ability to abstain. Well, very surprising. Obviously not. It's like they found, well, some kids who hadn't eaten found it harder to abstain. Well, with more ghrelin, the hormone that we produce in our digestive tract that makes us hungry, with more ghrelin circulating through our synapses, well, we're more likely to want to satisfy that hunger craving. They also found that greater socioeconomic background meant that those children from a higher socioeconomic background were also able to abstain. And you can expound on different theories for that, which I won't do right now. But these are external variables that affect willpower. It becomes a bit philosophical. Like I said, I'm a pragmatist. I'm not a scientific realist. All of this is written and discussed and explained within a scientific realist paradigm. But within that paradigm, it does bring up the free will debate, because obviously willpower and free will and effort, these things, they all essentially mean the same. I'll leave that maybe for the questions, and we can ruminate on it a little bit more. So here's my basic schematic one of the things I present to clients: stimulate, guide, facilitate. These are things that apply directly to exercise, just to give you an idea of a rundown. And there's obviously different ways we can do that with exercise. And I find that, if we just do these three things, people are more likely to exercise. And I don't need to drill them on. And I never say, don't you want to be thinner? Don't you want to be stronger? Don't you want to be able to play with your grandchildren? I used to do that sort of stuff. But as Daniel Kahneman said, we think that we often mistake that a change in behavior, we induce a change in behavior with driving forces, when actually, well, as he says, it's about removing restraining forces. And that would obviously be in terms of facilitating and guiding behavior. So a couple of things that aren't on my slides, and couple of things that are on my slides that I just have here. Sometimes obviously have emotional blockages towards exercise, and how do I deal with that? Emotional blockages can be from a severe trauma. Maybe they were teased on the playground, maybe they were teased playing sports. There's shame, embarrassment, and all these emotions to overcome. My approach is quite simply desensitization and exposure therapy, through imagining themselves in that environment as best as possible, and getting them to connect with the neurological rewards of exercise, maybe in a private environment or in a safe environment where they feel safe. But often those emotions are obviously, with guidance, they're overcome. When we're not part of a gym or a fitness community, the oxytocin says they're doing something that I don't. So the oxytocin says it's me and them. As soon as we join, it's me and us. So those are sort of the steps that I take towards any sort of emotional blockages that my clients might have. And another thing I've outlined here, which I said before, is the moral obligation towards exercise. I don't drill people on this. It's written allegorically in the story, so it's implicit as opposed to explicit in the book. But again, I think I'm hard to come by people who disagree that we have a personal, family, community, societal, and environmental moral obligation to take care of our physical well-being. But I'll leave that open for the discussion, and I'll leave it there for now.
So thank you so much for a great presentation. Let's give Simon a well-deserved virtual round of applause, and thanks a lot. Really stimulating in more ways than one.